This is the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast, Episode 47. What role does soil health have on IPM decisions? I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Today we'll explore Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. It is a science-based decision-making process that combines tools and strategies to identify and manage pests as defined by USDA. It's a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risk. We'll start by discussing IPM and soil health with a farmer in the northwestern corner of the state of Illinois that has been transitioning some of his acreage to regenerative agriculture.
My name is Keith Gorham. We farm in western Rock Island County. It's right along the banks of the Mississippi River, so we have a very diverse, different types of soil. We have heavy river bottom gumbo all the way to clay knobs, sand knobs, and timber soil. So it's very diverse in the soil types.
I assume that means you have a pretty diverse set of conservation practices that you might use in the operation as well.
Yes, it's definitely a challenge from every one year to the next. But I'm fourth generation at this, so we've kind of learned over the generations farming the same ground that what works and what doesn't. But no, I've been no-till we've been there for about 15 years. We started using the regenerative, what now they call regenerative ag principles back in 2015.
What does that mean?
Regenerative ag, to those that aren't familiar with it, is basically, in layman's terms, it's going back to the old ways. It's going back to letting nature make the decisions for you, as long as you can observe and try to manipulate nature as much as you can, but not using chemical or commercial inputs any more than you have to.
So what kinds of things do you do?
Well, we've been transitioning more and more acres into this regenerative every year. I guess the main thing, since we were obviously already no-till, we started using some single species cover crops, which cereal rye is kind of the go-to there. We started using that, and then we started looking into more multi-species, because the more you study about this regenerative ag movement, anything in a monoculture is not going to get you to where you want to be, especially with the disease and the insect pressure we're having nowadays, let alone the nutrients, the fertilizers. Then we started integrating our cattle into those covers instead of just grazing corn stalks like you'd done years past. In 2019, we had a lot of prevent plant ground being in the river bottoms. That gave us a chance to try a whole bunch of different cocktail mixtures of different species plants all in the same year. So that was kind of the big eye-opener year.
And then in 20 and 21, were you able to follow up, and do you fall graze then some of those?
Yeah, we fall graze some. And also to keep this at scale, because us as well as most people, they can't graze all of their acres. And that's the biggest thing. Anybody could probably do this on their home farm close to the pastures or so forth. But to really scale this up, you got to be able to do it without livestock as well. So we started just trying different things, and we found that the diversity in the plants is that's the key to all this.
By diversity, do you mean you're using ryegrass and brassicas and other sorts of things?
Yeah. Yep. Rye, your grasses, your brassicas, a lot of legumes. What we're trying to achieve is getting to zero inputs as far as commercial fertilizer goes. We're down to one herbicide pass. We've got like 40 some, almost 50 acres in zero nitrogen now for corn crop. I mean, we've eliminated P and K. Our tests come back, and we use the Haney test for most of our soil testing now. Comes back, I don't know if we'll ever have to put P and K on this ground again by using these practices with the cover crops.
I'm interested in the fall grazing just a bit more. Do you interseed the crops to get them started earlier, or do you wait until you've harvested?
Well, what we've done is, instead of just being a corn-bean rotation, we've introduced small grains. We started moving our rotation more heavily to the wheat, the winter wheat, so to speak. So that way our cash crop is out of the ground, it's harvested, and we have time for these multi-species cocktail mixes to actually get a firm hold. And then that opens you up to grazing. And actually, I think these small seeds have been probably our most profitable acres, because we'd harvest the wheat, sell the wheat, and then bale the straw. Maybe a lot of these acres now, it's not a good idea to bale the straw if you want to increase your carbon and organic matter. So we introduce seed these cocktail mixes in, and then graze in the fall. So that's got a value right there as well.
Do you need to use rotational grazing when you do that?
Yeah, we play with a lot of different things. We're doing some rotational. We're doing some of what they call mob grazing, where you bring an excessive amount of animals onto a 1 or 2 or 3 acre paddock and graze them for a matter of 24 hours and move them. So that's kind of the neatest thing we've been doing lately, is doing the mob grazing. And we have one farm that we're kind of using that as our experimental on that. Just by what you see when you get into this regenerative ag stuff, you'll see a lot of people doing that, and that really works. The animals actually trample, and that's what I meant earlier by going back to nature. It kind of replicates what the buffalo did, the same thing we're doing by moving them into a small area and then moving them.
You don't have a compaction problem?
No, we don't. There's really the compaction at that time of the year. You wouldn't have to worry about it as much either,
because you have heaving and frosting during the winter months to take care of part of that.
Yes. In addition to that, we've always got something growing in the ground, and we're not grazing it down to a golf course. I like to say, we're not grazing it down to your front lawn. They're actually wasting 2/3 of it and only taking the top third is what the goal is.
How many beef cattle can you manage on an acre in this form?
Oh, there's different opinions on that. Some people say 100,000 pounds per acre. I mean, these are some of the guys that are really, really doing it on an extreme scale. We're only running 30 head, on that acre.
I'm interested not only in the conservation and regenerative methods you're using, but also the integrated pest management, that idea that you're scouting. What kinds of things do you incorporate?
Well, that's probably the neatest thing we've seen. But once we started getting our mixes to where we had, three species going, we started seeing, I think it was after the 3rd year, we started seeing the visual change. We're seeing more beneficial insects. I took off on a chase trying to study the beneficials, because I always heard that there was 1,700 good insects for every one bad. And we started seeing stuff that I haven't seen since I was a kid here along the river, was dragonflies. We started seeing a slew of dragonflies after our 3rd year. The ground beetles, which I don't know if I just never paid attention, but they are there in droves now in our cover crops. And come to find out, they're a beneficial insect that's actually predator to the ones that we're putting all these chemicals and pesticides and everything out to get. Our disease pressure is little to none as well. I mean, there was a learning curve there. The first couple of years, it wasn't all rosy, but once we got off of that, after year 3, then you started seeing these changes.
It's all well and good, but unless you've got a market or it actually works as a commodity, it doesn't really mean that you can farm this way. Have you found a market for your products?
Yeah, we're no different than anybody else. Actually, our non-GMO corn is going to an inland elevator that it's just going in with the mix of the other corn. We also have an outlet locally that's a grain alcohol producer. Now they pay a premium, a 20 to 40 cent premium on that, which is all well and good, but that isn't the reason why we did it. We feed cattle ourselves and also sell some freezer beef. And I don't know, it's a good talking point to be able to sell non-GMO fed, grain fed type beef. But no, the actual non-GMO premium wise, that isn't the reason why we did it. We just wanted to go back and try to get away from all of the I guess one guy said when we first started studying this, wouldn't you rather sign the backs of all these checks instead of the front? Instead of buying, we'd like to keep more of that profit for ourselves.
And do you find that's the case?
Yes, actually, we'd studied that, and back, what was it, 2020, our corn crop, we were off a little bit on our yield compared to our conventional rest of the farm. and we were $82 an acre more profitable on our zero input. Now on zero input, we're still having to do one herbicide pass. We're not calling ourselves organic or any of those terms, but we are seeing that we only have to hit it with one herbicide pass. So we've eliminated our N, we've eliminated our P, eliminated our K, and now we've cut a herbicide pass out of it.
What do you think is the most important lesson you've learned through the process?
Oh, there's a lot of lessons learned, some of them the hard way, some of them the easy way. I guess it still comes back to diversity. When we first started, no-till, then rye, we learned that the diversity is the key to it. We have to be able to get that cover crop out there. We have to be able to manage that cover crop, whether it be roller crimp, which we're just starting to do the roller crimping this year. But that's the biggest lesson learned, is that it comes back to the diversity. You can't just do one thing and come in the house and make yourself feel really good about what you've done because it's the buzzword for that year. You have to be committed to it. It's not an easy thing to start out with, but it is scalable if you can take it to a level, over our 400 or 500 acres of grain. We're at, I don't know, about 20-25% right now that's fully off the chemical system.
And finally, what advice do you have for other farmers who are interested in adding conservation practices with a focus on integrated pest management, or IPM?
I guess the first thing is, if you're doing no-till now and you'd like to do a cover crop, or maybe you're doing a cover crop like cereal rye, is get comfortable with the rye and maybe with a legume like clover, which is easy. Then try to expand into multiple species. Get comfortable as quickly as you can with them, and you'll see the differences quicker than what we did. Adding small grains, if you can, especially on a year like this where wheat is, high price, there's definitely profit in it. And even harvest some of that seed. Say if you have some rye out there, harvest some of that, and that saves you money on your next year's cover crop. But we have definitely become much more profitable, even with a slight yield drag on corn. Our beans yields have gone up, but we're still more profitable. I guess that's the biggest advice I got, is take it easy. Don't go too fast, but try to get there as soon as you can, if that makes any sense.
That's Keith Gorham. He farms in the western part of Rock Island County along the Mississippi River in the northwestern corner of the state of Illinois, and has been transitioning some of his acreage to regenerative agriculture, including a beef cattle operation. I wondered what this all might mean in a different context as it's related to IPM, integrated pest management and soil health, across the whole of the state, and how more conventional farmers can put some of this into place. Nick Sider is an extension field crops entomologist, where IPM, integrated pest management, is often used. I asked him to tell me a little bit about the research he's been conducting, especially that which is related to soil health and IPM.
I do projects on a variety of insect pests in corn and soybean. A lot of my work is focused on the corn rootworm, which is the most economically important pest of corn in Illinois. Also do some work looking at the impact of cover crops on insect pest management in Illinois. We have a current project that's part of a large regional protocol looking at termination timing of cereal rye ahead of corn and what impact that has on insect pest pressure as well as on weeds and diseases. Did a similar project on soybean over the last few years. So in soybean, we found that the risk of insect damage to that crop was relatively low following a cereal rye cover crop. And we expect the risk to be a little bit higher in corn, simply because there are more insects that make that jump from rye, a grass, over to corn, another grass crop. So really interested in the impact of cover crop termination timing on how likely you are to see insect pest damage in corn in particular.
How is it, Nick, that soil health and other conservation practices, things like cover crops, influence insect activity? What considerations should be taken?
So when you look at the effect of conservation practices, and especially cover crops, on insect pests, certainly they do have an effect, as you might imagine. That effect is going to depend in large part on the species of cover crop that you're talking about, and then the species of the crop as well. And it also might depend on a variety of other environmental factors, including temperature, moisture, the sorts of conditions that we have, especially early in the season. We find that cover crops can favor certain beneficial insect species, ground beetles in particular, some of the ground-dwelling predators that we have. They can favor some pest insects as well. For instance, if you're using a rye cover crop, like many farmers in Illinois are, you are more likely to see armyworm damage following that rye cover crop. Depending on your residue management, you may be more likely to see slug damage following that, especially if you get into a situation where you have a lot of ground cover and a lot of moisture. In terms of considerations a farmer should take, especially if they're adopting a new practice, would be to take a few extra scouting trips, especially early in the season, just to see if there's any damage out there that you're not used to seeing. The sorts of pests that you might see are going to depend in large part on your geography, even within the state, on what sorts of local situation you're in terms of field history and that kind of thing. Overall, the risk of early season insect damage in Illinois is pretty low, and that's whether you have a cover crop or not. But again, this can increase the risk of certain pest issues, especially if we talk about a cover crop that's closely related to that cash crop. So for instance, if you have a grass cover crop and you're planting corn, that's going to be a higher risk situation than for instance if you're planting cereal rye ahead of soybean, which is our most common cover crop system in Illinois. Similarly, if you plant a clover or a vetch ahead of soybean, you could get into some unique pest issues there from insects like stink bugs and cutworms, for instance, that might cross over from that clover to another legume, a soybean. So highly dependent on the system, highly dependent on the year. The best thing that you can do, especially early on when you're just starting to adopt a cover crop system, would be to be vigilant. Now, similar, if we talk about conservation practices, if you're in no-till, for instance, the pest complex that you're going to see in a no-till system is going to be a little bit different than you see in a conventional till system. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, but different. And so, for instance, if you're in no-till, you're more likely to see an insect like Dectus stem borer, for instance, in your soybean crop. You're more likely to see black cutworm in those systems in general, especially if you combine a no-till system with spotty control of winter annuals in the spring. So just keep in mind when we alter something in the system, it does alter pest management, but the main thing is to be vigilant, to scout early in the season, and to identify any insect problems that come up when you still have time to do something about it, when you still have time to apply control in those rare cases where it's needed in Illinois.
Can you maybe discuss a bit more what the current research is saying about the conservation practices, for instance, that are being deployed by producers, no-till, and or the soil health practices that they might be using, and what influence they have on IPM or integrated pest management?
So far, a lot of our research has looked at the most common cover crop system that we have in corn and soybean in Illinois, and that's cereal rye ahead of soybean. So in that system, we've looked at the effective termination timing. We've looked at simply the difference in the insect pest and beneficial species complex in soybean in fields that have a cover crop versus fields that do not. And we've also looked at some large scale field experiments, just evaluating the impact of that rye or winter wheat cover crop ahead of corn and soybean. What we've found by and large is that while there is, you are more likely to see certain insect pests following cereal rye cover crop, it's not that high of a risk, particularly in soybean and particularly if you're talking about a grass cover crop ahead of soybean. So does it increase the risk of seeing some chewing early in the season? Yeah. Particularly from armyworm, you're more likely to see that early in the season following a rye cover crop. Is armyworm a big problem in soybean? Generally, no, it isn't. The species that we're seeing early in the season here, the true armyworm, that's different, mind you, from fall armyworm that we had quite an outbreak of this past year. But with that true armyworm that often shows up in those cereal rye cover crops, they don't feed particularly effectively on soybean. They don't survive well on it, and generally they're not going to cause stand loss in that system. So overall, the risk of insect activity following a cover crop in Illinois, especially in soybean where we have the most results, it's relatively low. And certainly I wouldn't say when you talk about your IPM decision making, insect management would not be the first thing I think about if I'm deciding whether or not to put in a cover crop or another conservation practice. The first thing I'm going to think about is the agronomics, the benefits you're trying to get from that, the agronomic risks that might be associated with that practice. That would be my first consideration. In terms of insect pest management, yeah, there are problems that can happen, but they're problems that can be managed, problems that can be mitigated, especially if those fields are scouted properly. Typically, you're able to identify any early season damage while you still have time to do something about it. The controls for most of our early season insect pests, if you get them out there in time, you can control them effectively, like with an early season well-timed insecticide application, not an insecticide that's just going out just because at the time you put a herbicide down, but an insecticide that's going out when that pest is out there at an economic threshold in a susceptible stage for management. So really, insect management shouldn't be your primary concern when deciding whether or not to adopt one of these soil health promoting practices. But you should make a point in those fields to just be a little more vigilant, especially if you're new to the practice, to get out there a few times early in the season and see what you've got in terms of stand, see if you're seeing any stand loss from insect pests. One thing to note there early in the season, in both corn and soybean, a little bit of chewing in general at that time of year isn't going to have an impact on yield. It's not really going to affect you. It's not until you have stand threatened from these early season insect pests that you're really losing bushels because of that. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at managing insect pests early, not just in those fields that follow a cover crop or some other soil health promoting practice, but in all of your fields, really.
So that's a small glimpse into some of the work that field crops entomologist Nick Sider has been doing for University of Illinois Extension here on campus. Let's transition to one of the commercial agriculture educators. Chelsea Harbach is located in Monmouth, Illinois, and she also has been working on IPM, or Integrated Pest Management. I asked her to tell me just a little bit about what kind of research she's been conducting.
Yeah, so I'm on a couple different projects. So my PhD research involved cover crops and soybean cyst nematodes. So I think my experience there with cover crops fed well into some of the stuff that was already going on. So one of the projects I'm on has to do with cover crops and soil health. And that's a statewide project with I think we have 9 on-farm locations, and we're kind of assessing soil health over 5 years. We just completed the second year of that trial. I've gotten involved in some plant disease stuff. So last year I did some soybean cyst nematode and seed treatment trials. That was a part of a NCSRP program. And this year, I'm actually getting involved with Carl Bradley. He's doing some red crown rot research at the Ore Center. So that is exciting for me because that's a new disease that I haven't worked with before. And then we have a couple of different projects that we submitted for grant funding to look at cover crops. That one is like a more just like cover crops and like cultivars, seeding rates, termination dates, and that kind of thing. And then the other one is digging in a little bit more on this soybean cyst nematode cover crop. I'm just going to call it a conundrum because that's what I feel like it is.
Well, tell me a little bit about that. Why is it a conundrum? What's there?
The literature, the like past research that's been done on soybean cyst nematode, which I think from here on out, I think I'm just going to say SCN. So the past research that's been done with SCN and cover crops, the data are not consistent, or maybe like the methodology is like a little questionable. So, I spent 4 years looking at this conundrum specifically, and like still didn't find any consistent significant effects. But there are people who I think still think that cover crops can help with SCN, and I can see some of the logic behind it. When we're talking about like soil health, it takes a long time for ecological shifts to happen in the soil. And so, I could see how maybe we might detect some differences in some longer term systems, like no-till cover crop systems, but we don't have, those data. So it's the proposal that was submitted is one that I think might actually be able to like address some of those questions. So that's kind of exciting.
I know you've been watching things for a long time now and working with some of the conservation methods, looking at cover crops. Is there anything within the conservation area, maybe one conservation practice that is more influential than others as it regards integrated pest management or IPM decisions?
Well, so when it comes to like IPM, like I'm always gonna preach number one is gonna be like crop rotation. And I don't know if that's necessarily considered like a conservation practice, but in kind of like in a sense it is, because you're diversifying the plants that you're putting out there, and that helps with the soil microbiome. But as far as like cover crops are concerned, I think my thoughts on cover crops, with regards to like IPM for diseases is, there's so many when you're thinking about IPM, there's just like so many different ways that you can manage diseases that are going to be you got like host resistance, um residue management, which I know can go against some of the conservation practices, but that is an important aspect of IPM. And then, chemicals if and where needed, assessing thresholds and whatnot. But when we think of adding cover crops into like as a tool in IPM, I have a difficult time, saying like for sure whether or not that's something that we should look into as far as managing diseases. What I think the more appropriate way to look at cover crops when we're talking about plant diseases is, just understanding how this added aspect, this added practice in your system affects crop diseases. So yeah, that's kind of my thing with cover crops. Like, if you want to manage diseases, don't look at cover crops. I say, stick with your other pillars in your IPM program, and just know how cover crops affect plant diseases that maybe have been historically a problem in your system.
Any advice for farmers interested in changing their IPM decisions based on the implementation of conservation practices?
So the biggest thing I'm going to say is, just know conservation practices are great. I think they are important. But if you have diseases or pathogens or pests that are historically a problem in your field, I think it's going to be important to, gain some sort of understanding of how that have historically been a problem. So like for cover crops, if you have a field with a history of pythium, like seedling rot in the spring and corn, that's one where you might need to be a little more thoughtful and tactical about the way you introduce a cereal rye cover crop into that system, because cereal rye is a host for a couple different Pythium species, and can almost make a Pythium seedling disease problem worse with corn following cereal rye. So you shouldn't be discouraged at all from using these conservation practices, but it's just about knowing what your historical problems are and how these new practices might affect these problems. So that way you can, look at your IPM tools and figure out how you can manage these diseases as you move forward.
Chelsea Haverback is a commercial agriculture educator for University of Illinois Extension. She's located in Monmouth, Illinois. You've been listening to the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast. This has been episode 47. What role does soil health have on IPM decisions? The program was produced in conjunction with Illinois Extension Watershed Outreach Associate Rachel Curry. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason.